We thank you so much for first the overview of modern landscape architecture, the overview of Highland Hills, and that stunning example you just showed us, Mila. We actually have time for questions. And a little back and forth. Dennis, you have strong opinions. Want to sit at the table or gather around this? Let's go to the table.
Sure.
All right, Camden, Sheila, Diane, Jim, questions? No pressure.
I have a beginning question, and then I'll have a microphone for anyone else who wants to. You mentioned, I think you mentioned gendered landscaping, and I don't know what that is. Can you explain it? Sorry, what was your question? I think you mentioned gendered landscaping, and I'd like to know.
I had to go so fast and be so general. I'm sorry about that. I was talking about the gendered spaces of the mid-century garden, especially as it was espoused in these magazines like House Beautiful, where there would be a terrace that was specifically for men to cook and grill. I mean, like your own house probably still has these spaces that are really set aside for different people's very gendered activities. The children were here. The wife's, little garden things that she played with were over here, and that's all really specified. And it would say, this is the wife's space here for her little things, and this is his space for putting the apron on, and this is where the car goes. And it was very programmed in a way that aligned kind of what mid-century gender roles were meant to be. I mean, and I said this in sort of a quick way, but they weren't just telling people, here's the kind of house that you should have and the kind of landscape it should include, but how you behave in those spaces was also part of how they sold these kinds of plans to people.
Thank you.
Can I ask a quick question along those lines? Do they still include spaces for drying clothes?
No.
Speak into the microphone.
Okay. So my question was, in the post-war period, was there thought for spaces to dry clothes?
Absolutely not. No, you had a new washer dryer. Yeah, you had all those appliances were a big part of how space was arranged in the house.
So they were taking away the woman's space.
Anybody else?
Is it on?
Up.
No, we got the mic there.
Oh, do I need? I have a very loud voice. Is it Mila? Mila? Is that on? Oh. I'm curious about the size of the acreage of the house at the end of Ricard Lane, because it seemed. Is it two lot? Is it over an acre? Or is it an acre? Oh, you know that. Is it your house?
Oh, go ahead.
1.2.
1.2. Thank you very much. And do they have a preference for native plants, for non-invasive plants? Is that part of the scheme? I know, I'm kind of smiling.
Yeah, so there are native plants and there are adaptive plants that might not necessarily be native, but really are suitable for the current conditions, and with the climate change, they really have adapted, but not invasive. So predominantly native and adaptive plants will be part of the garden, of the new garden. Yes, I think I read somewhere on one of the documents I was reading was talking about the management, right? Like living with nature doesn't necessarily mean you don't care of it, because if you don't maintain it, that's how the invasives come in and they threaten the native plants and the native communities and affect the native wildlife. So there is definitely a strong need for thinking about maintenance and to restore the health of these systems.
Sheila? Yeah.
I was wondering if you could explain what is involved in a rain garden.
Yes, great question. So a rain garden is a small depression that you usually grade part of the site, or you can also have downspouts connected to go to that small depression. It has a layer of gravel underneath. It has a special soil called bioretention soil, and it's really porous and allows for the rainwater to percolate quickly through. And the main purpose of the rain garden is to really slow the release of the stormwater runoff to enter the system later when it's not. So for example, if we have a flash flood situation where we have this for an hour, we have several inches of rain, they overload the system. And so the rain garden creates a temporary storage, if you will. In addition, the plants clean that water. So it's whenever it drains within 24 to 48 hours. And if you need to do a percolation test, if the soils underneath cannot perk, then you have to have an overflow that takes this water from the bowl, takes it out to the system. But this is like much, much later than your flash flood is happening, so it's not overloading the system. Was that too much explanation?
Yeah, I might just pick up on that because some of you may then go home and say, well, I can just dig a hole in my backyard and put some irises in it and I'll be good. The reason that Mila is saying you need to have the gravel layer at the bottom and a special very sandy or porous soil mix is because if the thing does not drain, and I always use 6 to 8 hours, like within a day after a heavy rainfall, within 72 hours you will get mosquitoes and then you will get West Nile, and that's not good. So that's why rain gardens, I would say, are not for the faint of heart, but they are for people who care about their water quality and the downstream impacts to their watershed. Well, typically how you solve that is you have an overflow pipe. You have a standpipe that is usually PVC, and it's usually a foot above the level of the plants. So, and if you ever see one of these things, you say, what the heck is that thing? Why is that sticking up out of there? That's the overflow. So if the water rises higher than that, that overflow is then connected to a storm drain. So it will evacuate to the municipal system. And again, that's important because, again, if it just overflows, then you're causing flooding downstream. And on a macro scale, that's very bad. Oh, yes. Yeah, another name for it is BMP, or best management practice. Yes.
Here's a question for the Honorable Dennis. From your description of Holland Hills, Davenport must have been an extraordinary developer, one in a million. I can't imagine that traditional developers would have regarded what is now Holland Hills as very promising territory for creating a suburb.
Well, I totally agree, and what I'll say is, anecdotally, I wish I had him for a client. He's the most enlightened client I've ever heard of. And what I'll tell you is, in my career, I've designed many developments around the DC area. And I always, when I can, pitch the idea of, what if you do a modern landscape? And what if you do modern buildings? And they look at me like I have 3 ears. It's like, what are you talking about? And it gets back to what John Burns would say, because you have to go to the bank to get the money. And the bankers, if you say, I'm going to do something that's different, and it doesn't sell, then they're stuck with the loans. So I admire his courage. I admire his vision. I hope he made money in his lifetime. I don't know if he did. But, God bless him.
For sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so I grew up in Holland Hills in the 50s and 60s, and behind our house we planted, I don't know how much English ivy all over the place. And there was a huge nest of bamboo between Martha's Road and the Thorpe Estate. So my question, Dennis, is, did those early landscape plans encourage or allow invasive species? I mean, what was the deal about the ivy? I mean,
Yes, they did, because they didn't know they were invasive. And I'm gonna single out myself. In 1990, I wrote a little pamphlet called A House in the Woods, a guide to doing landscape in Holland Hills. And I had a recommended list of plants. And if you get it and you look at it, you're going to really realize, oh my God, he was recommending English ivy. Because in 1990, it was okay. It was seen as a fast-growing, slope-hugging, erosion control kind of understory thing. So what it really means, and if we ever revise that, that's the first thing that's coming out. But what I'll tell you is we're learning. All of us are learning every day, every year, and that's why I tried to include sustainability in my presentation, because there are practices that we are doing now today in Holland Hills that were not known in 1949. So we have to stay current, we have to learn, and we have to grow.
As an aside to that, when there's an anecdote that when there were some volunteers working in our parks pulling out ivy, someone came along that was an original settler and said, "We planted every piece of that."
Oh, no.
Well, I think this, I'm speculating here, but I'm assuming that this was probably what was available at the local nurseries as a plant source, because a lot of the notion of these, like the perennials, the blooming perennials, the ornamental grasses, that was brought much later. I think, I don't know what year exactly, but later as an influence to Europe, and now in the last 20 or so years, there's the big movement towards native plants, which we are still having a hard time sourcing them at local nurseries, because nurseries are mass-producing things that spread fast and grow fast, and these are the invasives, unfortunately. But as Denny said, things are changing, and we're all adapting.
The canopy is so important to the Holland Hills area. Is there a way to manage that, or is it to the individual owner? And then what about a snag, a tree that comes down? Is it considered to get a contractor in to take it out, or is it part of the wildlife conditions?
Well, there's two parts to that question. One is, if it's on your property, you are, when you become a homeowner in Holland Hills, not only are you a home manager, you are a forest manager. And you are responsible for any trees that die on your property, and you have to take care of them. Now, in many cases, what I'll tell you, I have a tree that was snapped in half during the derecho. I now have a 40-foot tall stump in my yard. I am letting it stay there because that stump is a haven for bugs, and now I have tons of birds. So there's different attitudes on how you deal with quote-unquote waste or damaged trees. But I'll also tell you, it was nowhere near causing any potential damage to any life and limb or property away from my property. So if you have a tree next to somebody else's property, yeah, you're really obligated to make it safe. I mean, safety comes and trumps everything. Second of all, we do have some common area that Holland Hills owns, and we pay to have those trees cut down if they are dangerous or if they fall across the trail. But our practice as forest managers is we cut them into pieces and we leave it there. That's going to rot, it's going to decay, it's going to become compost and then soil.
We have time for one more question, if anyone has one. If not, thank you so much to the panelists, to the audience. Oh, one more.
Thank you. Thank you all for your presentations. It seems to me that the sort of the magic of the shared landscape it seems like it's so much called into question with the desires for fences. And I just wonder, are there landscaping solutions to the to the need for privacy, the need for a fence, versus a constructed fence?
I don't want to be hogging the microphone, but I live in Holland Hills, and these folks don't. You should add your own version on the house that you're working on. But it is a chronic issue. Legally, in Fairfax County, in which we reside, you can put up a fence, and you can't be stopped. And people go and they petition our design review committee to have a fence for their dogs to run in, and they build them. I consider that to be a shame.
But what would the alternative, I think he also asked, what would the alternative be?
My question is, are there dense enough hedges? Are there
Yes.
What are the strategies?
and can those be, peer pressured or incentivized in a way that those become the solution rather than constructed fences? And again, it seems also like an economical solution. That a hedge usually costs less than a fence.
Yeah, I think so for fences specifically, there are certain codes. So if you have a pool, you need to have, in Fairfax County, you need to have a fence. There are different solutions to screens that are different from meeting a code. So if you're looking for screening, yes, you can definitely use planting and understand, and this is where the topography also comes into play, because if you have downhill, it's one situation. If you have uphill, it's a different situation. Sometimes you don't necessarily have to use evergreens. You can use the lower trees and use the tops of those if the topography works for that, or you can just have the trunks become a more transparent type of fan or screen. Or you can use a vine. It just really depends. It's very site-specific and very client-specific. So I think it's hard. There's no one solution that works for.
Yes. Thank you all for being here. Some of you will be going to the Severide House tonight. Just remember to park adjacent to the Polk School instead of up at the Severide House. The driveway is very steep, but there will be shuttles that will take you up to the house from the base of the driveway if you would like.
Well, from the parking, so people will park their own cars and the shuttle will take them up.
Great. Thanks so much. Thanks very much, you guys.